The Assassin's Creed Hidden Blade, the perfect tool for the ultimate assassin. Hello and welcome to the channel. I am your host Tyrant, and this is the very first episode of Screen Tested, a brand new series on a brand new channel that I am very excited about. Now, the core concept of this new series is really simple actually. I take an item from popular culture, movies, TV shows, games, you name it, and then I try to build it from scratch, or in some cases, like today's case, I am going to modify an existing item. So, to summarize, I'm going to try and make an item from scratch or modify an existing item and then test it within the specific context that we see it in, whether it's a movie, TV show, or game, and determine whether it's practical in that scene. And if it's not, then I might try and modify the design to make it a bit more practical, or at least as practical as I can make it. Seems simple, right? In today's video, we are going to be testing the Assassin's Creed Hidden Blade. Is it useful? Is it practical? Does it even work? Now, here I have a replica. This is an officially licensed replica of the Black Flag version. The reason why I chose this one was actually really simple. It's on the simpler end of the Assassin's Creed Hidden Blade variety, meaning it technically only has one extension, meaning one blade. Here I have one of my friend's replicas who he graciously lended it to me for today's video. This one actually has two extensions. It has one here and one here. Replicating something like this would be a lot more time consuming and a lot more effort. So I decided to go with the Black Flag one, not only because it's my favorite game, it's also kind of the easiest of the bunch to make. Now, what I'm going to be doing in today's video is very simple. I am going to be using pretty much all of this. I think the spring tension and strength of this particular one is actually really good. So I'm going to be using the spring and this mechanism down here, but I am going to be replacing this blade with a aluminum version. Now you're probably wondering, why am I going to be using an aluminum version? It's actually very simple. First off, this particular blade, if we're talking about it, is rather thick, so we can conclude from that for the most part it's not going to be a very good cutter, simply because it has a larger blade stock with what I would say are rather bad edge angles, meaning these are very steep bevels relative to the blade thickness. The blade thickness is actually kind of unreasonable, especially for a knife. This is more along the lines of like a sword blade thickness. This is not actually ideal for this type of weapon. So we'll be testing that in a different sort of manner. I'm just going to be using a simpler knife that is attached to the wrist to test the concept. Now, I would say that the Hidden Blade is primarily a thrusting device. So using aluminum to test its thrusting capacity, I think, is reasonable, because I want to keep this blade thickness so we can actually test how well this is as a thrusting weapon when it's made pretty much to an officially licensed replica's size in terms of its thickness of the blade stock. Now, I want to make this clear right off the go. I think this is kind of a stupid concept, and the reason is really simple. Spring-loaded devices, just in general, are kinda very dangerous. And not only that, having just like that, a cool, useful item. Now, perfectly demonstrates the issue with these sorts of weapons. That one there was an unintentional firing, and that kind of is the core issue that I have here. Something that I do want to test for scientific purposes, of course, is if you would have a malfunction with a hidden blade, what would happen to your little fingers here? So I'm going to use some carrots. Carrots are a good human finger analog, a good finger medium. So I'm going to use some carrots to put them in the way of the blade and see what would happen if you had a little bit of a misfire. When you have a weapon like this that is attached to the wrist, where it covers your hand and can cause a lot of damage, this here is not a very practical weapon to have, especially when you can carry something like a fixed blade that you can slice with and thrust with. Something that I do want to mention is that other hidden blade designs from other games do have extra layers of functionality. However, they're not really relevant to today's video because we're just testing the hidden blade, but I did want to acknowledge it, that some other designs do have extra layers of functionality. Carrying a hidden knife, let's say it was on your belt or up your sleeve or wherever you want to put it, adds all of the benefits that something like a hidden blade would have without any of the downside. Another couple of important points that I wanted to mention was the spring tension and the tang. Now, when it comes to the spring tension, it's what delivers the actual force of the blade. But the problem with this is what happens when your blade comes into contact with something that has more resistive force than the spring? Well, the blade retracts. Now, I'm sure there are designs out there with locks and whatnot, but the problem is once you start using locks, at that point you might as well just use a fixed blade, because that's what you're doing, you're creating a fixed blade. Now, the other point that I wanted to bring up is actually the length of the blade. Now, because this is almost the full length of the mechanism, it means that there's not actually much tang down here offering structural rigidity, which means that when it comes to slashes like this on these two planes, it's going to be, well, necessarily weaker because there isn't much tang there. That's why I would say that primarily this would be something like a thrusting weapon, and indeed most of the games we see it used as a thrusting weapon. So when it comes to the build process of the hidden blade, I'm basically going to try and use as much of the original parts from this hidden blade replica as possible. Now, I will be using the same spring, the same screws, everything like that. I'm just going to try and machine my own actual blade out of aluminum. So I'm going to use this aluminum flat bar that I currently have that is around about the same thickness, maybe a touch bit thinner. I'm going to cut it to shape, then put it on the belt sander to add on my bevels and the point. I'll then machine down a central ridge to lessen the weight a little bit, and then I'm going to try and make sure that it pretty much matches the bottom of the original blade, so that all the springs and latches and locks, they can all fit, they can all interface correctly, so that I will have, for the most part, a functional hidden blade. I'm also going to be replacing the straps here, these Velcro straps. I'm going to put on some nice leather buckles. So let's go over some of the positive and negatives of this particular design, because it's the one that I'm going to be testing in today's video. Now, first up, I like that this one is, relatively speaking, quite small. It can fit reasonably well on the wrist. Now, next up from that, I like that it doesn't have any extra extensions, like I mentioned on this one, where it has a double extension. We have the actual primary blade used for thrusting or cutting or whatever, but we have this weird extension that has to bring the blade out further than the wrist. I don't really like that, whereas on this one, we actually just have the primary blade that extends, for the most part, past the hand. Now, in my particular case, it doesn't, but that also works as kind of the hidden blade aspect of it. It's hidden by your hand until it's not. So, to run through some of the build process, at least what I'm currently up to, I have the blade on the milling machine, and I'm currently milling in a channel. Now, this is mostly aesthetic, but it does help reduce some of the weight. I then want to put the blades onto the belt sander and grind in those bevels and put on the edge, of course. And then I want to clean the blades because there's still some blue ink left from when I was marking in the general shape of the blade. For the attachment method, at least for the fixed blade, I'm just using plates of aluminum and putting bolts and screws all the way through. This should be more than enough for this type of project, so I don't really have any structural rigidity issues. So that the blades can attach to my actual arm, what I'm going to use is some leather and some rivets along with a buckle. This should be more than enough and is pretty accurate to the games. And then to finish off the static blade, I will use the top half of one of the toys and simply epoxy it on. This is purely for aesthetics, just to make it look the part. And then for the aluminum version, all I need to do is reassemble it and give it a test fire or two and hope that it works. So I have finished up the build process, and now it is time to finally get into some of the testing. But I should first mention what it is that I actually built. Now, first up, I made a static steel version that will do all the heavy lifting when it comes to most of the tests. That is because, remember, we're only testing pretty much the concept of the hidden blade. But I also, just to be thorough, created the spring-loaded version made out of aluminum, just because I want to see how much power and kick it has. I don't expect it to be much, to be honest. But now let's finally get into some of the actual tests. Now, a lot of the hidden blade stuff is actually used on people. It's not really used in any sort of way other than pretty much to assassinate people. Now, I can't actually replicate that for the most part, so what I can try and do is try some of the movements in terms of how the hidden blade is used, and use some mediums that hopefully can be analogous to different types of, let's say, armor. For example, I'm going to be using one of my gambesons, quite literally the gambeson that I actually wear. I'm going to use that as body armor for the most part, or clothing armor, and see if the hidden blade is able to get through that. And then of course just a standard regular knife. The pool noodles are a good medium because they can actually test how much penetration that I might get. Because they are made of foam, they actually grip onto things like blades, and because of the blade geometry of the hidden blade, it's very thick, it's very bulky. I'm curious to see how far it will actually go into something like a pool noodle. Then we have water bottles. Water bottles are pretty good because they can actually test how sharp your edges are, and because we're testing things like thrusting and penetration when it comes to the hidden blade specifically, water bottles will be really interesting to see if they actually can go all the way through and how difficult it is as well. So first things first, let's get something out of the way right off the bat: the slashing capability of the hidden blade. With this fixed blade, the steel version, now the edge on this is not razor sharp, but it has a working edge, meaning for the most part it can cut through things if you put enough force into it. It wasn't really able to slash anything, it wasn't able to cut anything. However, the penetrative force of it was actually really, really good. It was able to pretty much get through everything except for the gambeson. People who aren't aware of what a gambeson is, they are basically, I would say, different layers of fabric all put together to create a fabric type armor that's very lightweight but is very resistive to a lot of blades for the most part, especially those that aren't super razor sharp and super pointy. We saw that the gambeson was actually able to stop the hidden blade, but not only the hidden blade, the knife as well, which is very pointy and very sharp. I wasn't able to get through the gambeson with any of the blades today. I also tested a little bit of the spring tension on the aluminum version with the carat analog, and it didn't cut it in half, but it did leave a huge gouge in the carat, and I certainly would not want that to be my finger. And something to mention is, on this particular version, the lock on this is a hair trigger. There we go. Basically, that was an accidental discharge there. It is super light. It is very lightweight. So after I tested the slashing, which didn't really work too well, and I tested the thrusting, and the thrusting was quite good on most mediums, I decided to actually flip the blade over and use it on top of the forearm, because I found that I wasn't able to generate huge amounts of power and force from the underside. I wanted to see if throwing basically punches with the blade would add any extra additional force, speed, or even power, and it did feel a lot more natural. I naturally prefer to throw a fist like that rather than like that. And for the most part, that is kind of accurate, as in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Whatever you think of the game, the hidden blade was, for the most part, on the top side, so that is also now accurate as well. But then we get down to the brass tacks of the concept of the hidden blade. Everything that I was able to do with the hidden blade, completely optimized, we don't have to worry about spring tension, we don't have to worry about any of all these extra things, it going off accidentally, it may be hurting you. The truth of the matter is, a fixed blade simply performed better. It was able to slice things, it was able to penetrate just as much as anything else. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on slashing with something like a fixed blade. When it comes to something like this, because it's not very long, I actually don't have much momentum if I was just to swing like that. I actually have to flick my wrist a little bit, and then I'm able to get that tip to move a lot faster, to actually cut things a lot cleaner. However, when it comes to something like this, because it's attached to your wrist, you can't really get that same flicking motion and be able to slash things as easily. Now, I know I already said that it's not a slashing weapon, that's fine, but it's just one of those things where it is a drawback in comparison to something like a fixed blade. Next up, I wanted to talk about attachment to the wrist. This was something that I found in testing, and I was pretty certain of this even before we got to testing, that is how these things actually attach to your wrist. They are just held on by buckles. So the problem with the attachment method is actually your forearm itself. because your forearm is shaped, it's thinner up at the wrist and then wider down near the elbow, the problem is when you're actually using the blade, if those buckles start to move, which of course they do because they have a big angle to slide on, they actually start to become more and more loose the more that you actually use it. So the attachment method is also a bit of a drawback. It's just one of those things because of where the actual weapon is attached to your body. So when it came time to actually testing some of the moves that were found in the game, I found them to be realistic. They're for the most part what you would do. Now I may not have had a human medium to actually test on, of course, but for the most part, I think the tests were pretty conclusive that as a thrusting weapon, it works, and it works very well. So let's get into the final thoughts for the Assassin's Creed Hidden Blade. First up, thrusting. This thing is very good at thrusting. Not only is it good at it, it's optimized for it, and it is satisfying. It's very fun to do. I would give it an A for its thrusting capabilities. Next up is its slashing. I give it an F. It's not very good at it. The blade is too thick. These edge angles are not really conducive to slashing. Next up, it's spring loading. Now, I just don't like weapons that are spring loaded, period. And this one is no exception, especially because of where it's attached and because it can get your little fingies. I give that an F. It's not very good with the spring loading sort of blade concept. Not a fan of it. Then we go on to the attachment method. The attachment method isn't bad. Like it could be optimized a little bit better if it was permanently attached to a larger gauntlet that could have a lot of tension. But for the most part, in the method that I tried, I didn't really have too much of an issue with it. I just felt like I could make it a bit more secure if I went that extra mile. But at the same time, it's still perfectly functional and it worked. So yeah. But this is where it all kind of falls apart for me, and that is simply that a fixed blade has all of the benefits that something like a hidden blade has, i.e. it's a good thruster, it's also a very good slasher, it doesn't pose anywhere near the same risk to yourself, and on top of that, it doesn't really need an attachment method because you hold it in your hand. I will admit that I did find using it on the top side a lot more practical, and it did alleviate some of that stress because obviously I can just move my wrist out of the way. There's much less chance of, your hand being like this and having an accidental fire, whereas your hand naturally wants to rest under like this where the blade can accidentally spring out. Just little things like that where I think this side for the most part might be a little bit better, but for the most part I think the Assassin's Creed Hidden Blade, at least this sort of design, isn't really the most practical thing, and everything that it is pretty good at, something like a fixed blade can also do. But that is going to be all for today's video. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below telling me how wrong I am about things. And don't worry, there will be another video next week putting something else to the test. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one. Get in there. What?